everyone. Thank you all so much, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, so I'm going to do this over Skype. I really, really appreciate it. So I'm Leslie Dewan. I'm the CEO of Transatomic Power, which is a nuclear reactor design company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And let me see if I can get this screen share working properly. Is the screen up? Excellent. All right. Thank you all so much. So I'm going to be talking today about some advanced nuclear reactor technology that I'm working on, and talk about not just the technology itself, but the very interesting history of the nuclear industry that has kind of made this technology possible or set the stage for these further developments, and then talk a bit about the process of commercializing hard technology that unfolds over long time scales. Now, to start, I became a nuclear engineer in, oh, sorry, are there video problems on it? Oh, no, okay. Sorry about that, thank you. Let me, you would have just seen me making crazy faces this entire time. All right. Change screen sharing settings, share my screen, and then, is that going? Is it a picture of Beijing? Okay. Oh, no, it's all good. Okay, so that's showing up the way it's supposed to. Thank you so much for helping me debug this. I appreciate it. Okay. Yeah, just give a shout if it's doing anything odd going forward. So I became a nuclear engineer in the first place because I'm an environmentalist, and I think that the world needs nuclear power alongside solar and wind and hydro and geothermal if we want to have any hope of combating the devastating effects of climate change that are caused by coal in particular. So here's a picture showing the air pollution in Beijing. On the left-hand side is one of the worst pollution days, and on the right-hand side is a comparatively clear day. And I think it just really drives home this urgent need for better forms of carbon-free power generation. So to answer the question of what mix of energy sources you need, I think you need to dive into a little bit more of what nuclear power is exactly. And that's, on the one hand, a very complicated question, on the other hand, a fairly straightforward question, and it's one that people have been trying to answer for a while. So this is a photo of the Atoms for Peace truck, which is part of an outreach program that was developed by the US Atomic Energy Commission in 1956. So they had this bus that would drive through the US, and there were several international ones as well, in one based out of Vienna and with the IAEA. It would drive through countries and seek to explain to people how nuclear power worked, how the basics of nuclear physics works, even as a way of demystifying the technology and making it more accessible to people. And interestingly enough, Walt Disney got in on this as well. So in 1956, that same year, he produced a book and accompanying animated feature called Our Friend the Atom, in which he sought again to demystify the science of nuclear technology, showing that ultimately it's just a fancy way of boiling water, while still capturing the inherent wonder that something as small as an atomic nucleus could contain so much power. To go into a little bit more detail about how all of this works. So here's a slide. Oh, good, the animation is working. This slide is included in basically every single undergraduate level nuclear engineering presentation. So I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, but I'm gonna try to point with it. So here's a very rough outline of what a typical type of nuclear reactor looks like. So on the very far left, you have your reactor vessel, where you have a large, stable number of nuclear fission reactions that collectively can generate a great deal of heat. That heat is used to boil water into steam. That steam drives a turbine, which turns a generator that produces electricity, and then the water is recycled back into the system. And so ultimately, nuclear reactors are just a a somewhat complicated way of boiling water. And you can think of this system as being analogous to many other types of power plants as well. So if you were a coal power plant, for example, your ultimate, basically this part of the system would look very similar, but your ultimate heat source on the left here would just be burning coal rather than nuclear reactors. Now, I want to go into a little bit more detail about the historical setting that caused the nuclear industry and nuclear entrepreneurship even to be where it is today. So one of the very first, at the very early days of the industry, so in the 1950s and the 1960s, people were working on a very wide variety of designs. So there were plans for nuclear reactors that were not just cooled by water, but cooled by liquid metal, cooled by gas, molten fuel designs, things that were really out there. There were plans for nuclear-powered airplanes and nuclear-powered cars, like the Ford Nucleon here, and nuclear-powered submarines as well. The nuclear submarines themselves are actually a pretty interesting case. So one of the first operating reactors for propulsion were in nuclear-powered submarines, and they used that type of design that was really similar to the schematic I showed you a few slides ago, where they have solid fuel that's cooled by liquid water. And so these were operating by the mid-1950s. And so after the US had these nuclear submarine reactors operating, they said, all right, well, the next obvious step is to get commercial nuclear power up and running so we can generate electricity from nuclear reactors. And as sort of a point of national pride during the middle of the Cold War, the US said, all right, well, we want to get this up and running as quickly as possible, and specifically we want to do it before the USSR does. And so instead of going back to the drawing board and finding the best type of nuclear reactor that would be ideally suited for land, the US instead took this submarine type of reactor and put it on land and hooked it up to a turbine and generator and used that to produce commercial electricity on land. And this, this worked, and it worked well. And today, all of the 99 operating reactors in the U.S. are this type of submarine-based design, and almost all of the reactors, more than 95% of the reactors operating worldwide, are this type of submarine-based design. But it can cause a number of problems. And one of the most striking problems is if you lose your cooling water in this type of nuclear reactor, the core can start to melt down. And that's what happened at Fukushima, that's what happened at Chernobyl, and that's what happened at 3 Mile Island in 1979. And so in 1979, you went, when there was this accident in this conventional type of nuclear power plant, it had a chilling effect on the rest of the industry. And so you went from this wide variety of designs being explored, you went from a large number of the light water reactors, the submarine-based reactors being built, to very, very minimal research. From 1979 and the following few decades, research into new types of nuclear reactors stagnated. And this stagnation was compounded by rising concerns about nuclear waste, about spent nuclear fuel, how you're going to handle this material that's radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. So how do you move from those early 1960s prototypes, the things like the airplane reactors, the car reactors, the liquid-fueled reactors, how do you move from that to a commercializable 21st century technology? And ultimately what you're trying to solve is you're trying to figure out the best way to solve the underlying problems in the design here. So my co-founder and I, co-founder of Transatomic and I, started talking about this extensively when we were about midway through grad school, when we were, I think, 3 years into getting our PhDs in nuclear engineering at MIT. Both of us were and are environmentalists, and we wanted to find a better type of nuclear reactor, maybe go back to the early days of the industry, explore another path, and find something that could solve the big issues facing nuclear reactors today, solve the issues of safety and waste and cost and proliferation. And so like good students, like good grad students, we started by making a graph. And so we said, all right, well, on the top, these are the 6 broad categories of nuclear reactors, of more advanced next generation nuclear reactors that people started looking at in the 1950s and 1960s. And then on the left, there are the three categories that we felt were the most important to make the best new type of nuclear reactor. So we wanted it to be something that has a high burnup, so you're using a very large fraction of the fuel and not leaving behind as much waste. We wanted it to be a low pressure system, ideally an atmospheric pressure system, so the parts don't have to be as thick and they don't have to withstand as much strain as a conventional nuclear reactor that operates at about 100 times atmospheric pressure. And we also wanted it to be a thermal spectrum, so lower energy neutrons, so you're not damaging the materials as much, you don't have to replace them as frequently, and overall leading to a lower cost of the plant. And we realized when laying it out that way that a type of plant called the molten salt reactor that used a liquid fuel rather than a solid fuel was actually really ideally suited for our purposes. And one of the benefits of this is that this type of reactor was already built and demonstrated in the mid to late 1960s at the Oak Ridge National Lab in the US. Here's another photo of the 8 megawatt thermal prototype that they built of it, and there's a person for scale at the top. And this is the reactor core here of the prototype that they built 50 years ago. Now, the most striking feature of this type of reactor is that it uses a liquid fuel rather than a solid fuel. So you can think of this picture as being analogous to the first reactor cutaway image that I showed you. But instead of having solid fuel with liquid water flowing past it, this molten salt reactor has liquid fuel flowing in the primary loop of the reactor. When it's in the reactor core, this liquid fuel is in what's called a critical configuration. So it again is generating a great deal of heat that's carried across heat exchangers to a loop with steam in it that turns a turbine that powers a generator that produces electricity. So in many ways it's very similar, it's just liquid fuel rather than solid fuel. And this gives it a number of really striking safety benefits for the system as well that I'll get into in another slide. So they built this reactor at Oak Ridge about 50 years ago. They proved out some of its really striking safety benefits, but there was a problem with it. So it required very highly enriched uranium as fuel, uranium that was enriched so close to weapons grade that it wouldn't be feasible for commercial deployment. And it was also very expensive. It was about 3 times as expensive as the conventional light water reactors that existed at the time. And so the technology ultimately was abandoned. This was in the mid to late 1960s. It was before there had been any commercial nuclear accidents. And they said ultimately, well, why would we pay 3 times as much for a safer nuclear reactor when we clearly don't need one, when the existing technology seems to be safe enough? And so the technology was tabled for decades. What my co-founder and I were able to do, using a lot of different computer simulations, a lot of different analysis into different types of materials, we were able to change 2 of the key factors in the design. We were able to change the moderator that slows neutrons down to the right power level to make them more likely to induce fission. We switched it from the graphite that they used in the old design to a zirconium hydride moderator that lets us fit about 5 times as much salt in the core. And we also changed the salt to a newer composition that allows you to dissolve in much more uranium. And changing those 2 factors effectively allowed us to increase the power density by about a factor of about 16, while at the same time allowing our system to run on very, very low enriched fresh nuclear fuel, or even the residual fissile material that's in spent nuclear fuel. And we were able to do this while keeping the same safety benefits of the original design that come from the liquid fuel. To go into just a little bit more detail about the safety benefits itself, so this is that same figure of the molten salt reactor primary loop. So you have your liquid fuel that's flowing in your primary loop, and then at the bottom of that loop, you have a freeze valve that's a plug of the same type of salt that's up here in the primary loop, only electrically cooled so that it's frozen solid. If you lose external electric power in the system, this freeze valve melts automatically, and all of the salt from the primary loop drains out into this low, flat auxiliary containment at the bottom. When it's in this containment at the bottom, it's no longer near the moderator, And by virtue of its geometry, it immediately becomes subcritical. So it's not generating nearly as much heat. And it's able to actually freeze solid over the course of a few hours. So if the system fails, if you lose external electric power, it's able to shut itself down, even if there aren't any operators on site, and gradually coast to a stop and solidify. And so that's in contrast to a typical nuclear reactor where if it fails, you lose electric power, you lose your water cooling, and it starts to melt and it starts to evolve gases off of the top of it. The other benefit of this system is that it operates at atmospheric pressure, so you don't have any large driving force to potentially push radioactive material beyond the site boundary, which is what you have at a typical nuclear reactor. So my co-founder and I came up with the baseline version of this idea just about 4 or 5 years ago when we were still in grad school, and we thought, well, this is interesting. We have this technology that seems like it works really well. There was a prototype 50 years ago that proved out a lot of the baseline engineering for it. We have computer simulations that are proving out the science for the extension that we're doing with it. And so what do we do? Like, do we keep this within academia? Do we try to partner with the national lab? And we decided that instead we would form our own company. We would form an advanced nuclear reactor design startup to attempt to commercialize this on our own. So we incorporated the company back in 2011 and immediately started working on, with some partners that we brought on, figuring out what the rest of the design would look like. How, we have a core, which is just the little part in there. Like, what would the balance of plant look like? How do you do, how do you spec the pumps? How do you spec the heat exchangers? What size is the system going to be? What market are you going to target? What worked well, we decided to target a commercial scale facility that would be 520 megawatts electric, the right size for grid scale power generation, and also the right size to replace the coal power plants that are coming offline worldwide, and also serve as an alternative for coal power plants that would otherwise be built elsewhere in the world, like the many coal power plants that are currently under construction in China. So we reached this stage of development when we were still in school, and then we finished school, graduated, and said, all right, well, we're going to be doing this full time. Like, this has traction. We need to keep going with this. And now we need to figure out where we're going to get venture backing, or where we're going to get some source of more substantial funding to be going ahead with this. We'd raised a friends and family round, sort of a local Boston angel investor round to get us to this point, but then we realized we really needed to ramp this up fairly substantially. And it was interesting. So this was back in 2014. There weren't really any other nuclear startups. There weren't really any VCs who were investing in this type of very long timescale technology. Like, still was not very long since Fukushima, and so there was sort of a broader cultural aversion to nuclear. And so it was interesting for us trying to pitch this to people. So we talked to a lot of the local Boston and New York and San Francisco area venture capitalists, and they said, okay, well, that's a really great idea. Like, that's an interesting idea for a new type of nuclear reactor, and we'd love to fund you, and can you have one built and operating within 6 months? And we said, well, no, of course not. And they said, well, what about a year? And we said, no, it's going to take 10 years. It's going to take 8 more years from where we're at right now. It's going to take like a much larger dollar amount of capital. Ultimately, we have some intermediate milestones in place, but it's going to be a long road. It was tricky for us to find investors whose timelines were really aligned with ours. And the key for us actually was to find investors who had invested in aerospace actually in the past, because there was a little bit more experience with that. And aerospace has sort of similar long timelines, similar ultimate large dollar amounts. Our very first investor was Founders Fund, actually. They were one of the big early investors in SpaceX, so they had sort of that aerospace background to them. And actually, when we first pitched to them and we said, all right, it's going to be 10 years, it's going to be ultimately $200 million to get one of those up and running. And they say, okay, well, that's a similar time scale and actually less money than it took to get the Falcon 9 off the ground. So we're comfortable with that. We're comfortable with that dollar amount. We're comfortable with those timelines. And this fund also is invested in other very regulatory heavy industries as well. So Airbnb, Lyft, Zenefits is a healthcare company. Palantir does big data analysis with a lot of government contracting. So they're familiar with working in that world that has other regulatory constraints, other like bigger supply chain constraints than you'd find in a typical software startup. And so they've invested in us across 2 rounds now and are a fantastic partner to be working with. So to cover where we're at right now and sort of the new challenges in this space, it's always very interesting because it's there are a lot of unknowns in the nuclear field, and there aren't very many nuclear startups. There may be 50 or 40 nuclear startups worldwide, so it's a lot of uncharted territory going on. What we're working on now is developing a prototype scale facility that would be 10 megawatts thermal that ideally we'd be able to build at a national lab site within the US. And this would allow us to prove out some of the operational and especially maintenance aspects of the design. And that we'd aim to break ground on that within 4.5 years from now. So spring of 2021 is when we're aiming to break ground on this prototype facility. In the near term, what we're working on is some material lifetime tests and component lifetime tests to figure out how long some of the metals and bimetallic composites and ceramic components in the reactor will last, and how that will ultimately how that will affect the cost of the design. So on the right here is a corrosion furnace where we're melting samples of salt with some of the different metals that we're looking at and some of the bimetallic joined metals. We have a laser interferometry system that can get some good in situ data on what the material breakdown will look like. Also, sorry, I forgot to mention this. All of this is being done under a sponsored research agreement with MIT. So our office is pretty much adjacent to the MIT campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we've been able to work with Professor Mike Short's group there conducting these tests. So he does radiochemistry and material corrosion for nuclear materials. And here's a sample of some of the melted salt that we're using here. That's actually a failed melt sample. It's supposed to all be that very clear greenish color, but we had some, our cover gas system wasn't working properly, so a lot of it corroded and turned into the oxide layer on top. So they spent a lot of time debugging how you properly do that melt system going forward. So one of the very interesting and unexpected kind of pieces of this journey was the regulatory side of it. So when I finished grad school and when I became CEO of Transatomic, I thought, like, all right, the biggest challenges will be getting the technology to work, getting it to be cheap enough, like figuring out some of the supply chain issues. And I didn't really anticipate all of the nuances of what it takes to get a new type of nuclear reactor regulated and licensed in the US. And it turns out, like, as hard as it is to get a conventional type of nuclear reactor licensed anywhere in the world, it's orders of magnitude trickier to get one of these next generation reactor technologies licensed. And we're really lucky now because over the past few years and even over the past 6 months, really, there's been a lot of collaboration between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Department of Energy in the US, and then the IAEA and a number of other groups worldwide to sort of broaden the existing regulatory pathways to make them applicable to advanced reactors. Because before now, or several years ago, there just wasn't even a checklist for how you license an advanced reactor. And that made it, and the fact that there wasn't a checklist effectively made it impossible to move forward with the technology. So all of this collaboration has been very positive in just figuring out a viable regulatory structure to get these licensed and built in the US. And interestingly enough, it's had very broad bipartisan support within the US on the legislative side as well. So the House, for example, unanimously passed a bipartisan nuclear energy bill to make this easier. And it's almost shockingly unheard of for things to be unanimously passed. But I think that people can, on the whole, agree that even if the conventional nuclear reactor designs have problems, there's so much benefit with these advanced reactor designs to address the safety and waste and cost and proliferation issues, and that the technology is worth pursuing and worth developing further. So I'm just going to close with this one slide that has a one of the kind of fanciful renderings of what the reactor might look like. So I mentioned before that our system operates at atmospheric pressure, and that's very good from a safety standpoint. It makes things easier from a design standpoint, and it also has a lot of implications when it comes to the civil engineering and architectural design of the plant. Since it's at atmospheric pressure, it has different cooling requirements, you don't need that typical big containment dome. You don't need those large stacks that are typical of the conventional nuclear reactors. So you can basically make it look a lot different. And something I've been excited about is this possibility of using new architecture to change people's emotional relationship to nuclear power in some ways. Like, for example, if I'm driving down the highway and I see wind turbines in the distance, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel happy that that's where power is coming from that good carbon-free source. And I think that potentially as we tell people more about the different benefits of these new types of nuclear reactors, how they can consume existing stockpiles of nuclear waste, how they have tremendous safety benefits and can't melt down, how they produce significantly less waste than the conventional plants, that they can change the relationship that they have to nuclear power and start feeling good about these new sources of energy going forward. Right. So that just wraps up my time here, and I'd be really glad to answer any questions now. And then I think also at the start of the lunch session, I'll be around on video feed for another half hour or so to answer any additional questions that you all might have. I'm going to try to switch this back to video feed if that works. All right. Hello, everyone. Cool. Yeah, I think I have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions. I haven't been following the clock too closely.
Hello, my name is Yannis Kourdakis. Listening to your presentation, so interesting, I kept thinking, is it possible to make a nuclear reactor at a household scale? So. And perhaps combine it with an array of batteries to store the energy, and so make it much more acceptable by the public.
Yeah, that's something that I would love to do. So you're asking about making reactors at the household scale. So
yeah. Or perhaps a neighborhood scale or something like that.
Or I'm sorry, the audio isn't coming through.
That's the main idea, yeah.
Oh. It's possible to make them at the household scale or at the small scale, but it stops being economically feasible once you get below about 100 megawatts electric. 100 megawatts electric, 80 megawatts electric is the cutoff below which it's just so expensive in terms of the levelized cost of electricity that you wouldn't really ever be able to recoup your investment. I mean, there are some groups that are working on what they call microreactors that would be at the 1 megawatt electric or 2 megawatt scale, but those would mostly be applicable for very remote mining regions in northern Canada, for example, where you're competing against diesel that's being trucked in. So you can allow for a much higher levelized cost of electricity over the lifetime of the system. But yeah, in practice, 80 megawatts, 100 megawatts is really the cutoff for that. And then on the flip side, you'd say, okay, well, why don't I make a 2 gigawatt or a 3 gigawatt reactor and really, have a very, very low levelized cost of electricity. But the problem with that is that there aren't really any places in the grid where you could drop in an additional 2 or 3 gigawatts. So you could make one that big, it would be very cheap, but no one would want to buy it because no one would need anything at that very large scale. Okay, cool.
Okay. Excuse me, may I? Hello, it was a great speech. Thank you so much. Just a simple question. Is there a patent on this great idea? I mean, you know, the big guys in the field, I imagine that, you know, would love to do something like that. So is there a patent on this idea? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I missed, I can't quite hear you. Is there anyone,
the main
sorry,
question
would anyone who's closer to the computer mind repeating that? Sorry about that. I just have the little microphone that's on the laptop.
Okay, so the main question is there a patent on this idea? Are you feeling safe that this is your baby?
Sorry. Oh, okay, yeah. So there were original patents filed back in the 1950s and the 1960s for the original version of the design. The part that we have patented is the specific combination of the moderator and the salt that we're using. Yeah, interestingly enough, they had used the moderator before in the 1980s. It's just that particular moderator material wasn't around in the mid to late 1960s when they first built it. So we took the 60s technology and the moderator from the 80s, a new type of fuel salt, and we're able to combine those. And sorry, did you ask also about like other groups that are working on the technology or other like larger companies? Or thank you so much for having me and looking forward to